Alright, we have four movies this week. We have two theatrical releases, one that Netflix put out this morning, and one that Disney Plus put out probably a couple weeks ago that I didn't realize was going to be something I needed to worry about, but then I heard something about it that kind of piqued my curiosity, so I went after it also. But let's start with the theatrical releases and go into The Call of the Wild. The Harrison Ford movie, or the supposedly Harrison Ford movie, that is obviously an adaptation of the book, as well as the next, popular dog movie. The dog that is now completely and totally animated, which is sounds like maybe a cheap idea at the when you look at it at the start, but then as it goes on, you sort of realize very quickly. I imagine it has a lot to do with how animated, uh, literally and otherwise, this dog has to be, and very his expressions are sort of really over the top to the point he almost might as well be a human character, minus the fact that he can't talk. That's about the only thing that he doesn't do. And you can see right away, after we get a really good look at the 20th Century Studios logo that we have to start getting used to, we immediately start off with the dog as a dog in a giant rich house with Bradley Whitford, where he basically gets everything he wants and people just kind of put up with him as this rowdy dog, and sort of immediately realize that there might be. I know something that I talk about a lot when I'm going into more in the area of criticizing something is tone. But I mean, really, when you see like the opening scenes of this movie and the way this dog runs around the house, you kind of immediately get the vibe when you get to the later portions of the story that you know are coming. There's probably going to be a tone problem when you start the place that this movie does, because he's running around the house and he's taken like all the rugs with him because he moves that quickly. He bounces into the beds of the children and they fly into the air, and they're basically inside a cartoon, with the way everything moves and the way everything reacts to the actions around them. And this was not really what I was expecting going in. I don't know if if that tone was set up in like the advertising or what, but yeah, that's how it starts off. And like I was saying, you immediately see why the dog had to be entirely animated rather than one or the other, or maybe a mixture of both. Could have been the case, but no, he is completely and totally 100% animated, as I said, in all the ways possible. And eventually, once he does a bunch of slapsticky stuff, like there's a whole gag where he like is trying to get his new collar off and he gets stuck in it. Stuff like that. It very abruptly tries to be very serious, but that's kind of what the movie is in its entirety. It is a bunch of slapstick with this practically cartoon dog that just suddenly slaps you with trying to be as serious as possible occasionally. Like that's how like every time he transitions to another owner starts. It's like it's gonna be really big and dramatic, and then it just kind of isn't. And I can't really tell what they wanted to go for here exactly. I know Chris Sanders, I believe is the director's name. This is his first live action movie, and you can get a sense that we're still kind of pulling him away from animation, and we're kind of watching that happen in real time. So there is that, and yeah, but once you get past like the over the top nature of this stuff, you get a sense, particularly when he gets taken in by Omar Sy and becomes like a sled dog. There's going to be inevitable comparisons to Togo that Disney Plus put out back in December, and that movie was much more real about itself, and like it was all about sort of like the real locations and everything, just feeling like it kind of had that feel of like the classic 90s Disney movie. And this one seems to be going for that same vibe, but I do think while it does, there are many circumstances I think where it does, reach that at least the best that it can. It's never gonna quite have that feel, that nostalgic feel, if that's what they're going for, with the really, really, really animated dog, whose animation you can kind of tell immediately. Like, it's one of those things where, like, you think about, like, The Bear and the Revenant or something, and where it actually looks like it's there. And when you hear that the dog's entirely animated without seeing anything, you kind of get a sense that that's what they would be trying to do, is just at least make it look as real as possible. And with today's technology, they could get away with that. But I feel like they're not even trying. It's almost like they want the contrast of this being a very obviously animated dog, because it's like you can see the detail on him, and which is impressive, but it's like it would be much more impressive probably if, like, the rest of the movie and the surroundings were also animated like him. But he really stands out against this live action background. So and the other dogs also, maybe not to the same extent, but yeah, because they're not near as animated, like, in the face as he is, and with all the expressions and all that. But yeah, and then we obviously get all the different storylines. There's like 3 or 4 stories in this one movie that could potentially be their own movie, and they're all sort of squeezed together. And I think especially the whole Omar Sy thing, when they're delivering the mail, and there's that whole thing, and then there's also him having the rivalry with the leader dog, and then it's the battle between which one of them is going to end up the actual leader and all that. That's basically its own movie there, and it's squeezed into this whole area before we've only seen Harrison Ford like once, when this whole thing has happened, like, from its beginning to its end. And obviously Harrison Ford is being used as the face of the movie, which I wouldn't go as, I think it's probably overkill to say it'd be misleading advertising, because once Harrison Ford is really in the movie, then that is, like, what it's about. It's just, I don't know how many people going in are going to realize it's the, like, second half of it, maybe a little less than half. But and that's kind of another case where you see, when we're introduced to Harrison Ford, he's got, like, he's seems to have this really tragic backstory. When we first meet him, he's got this, like, whole, like, just in the way, like, the soft way he speaks and just the way he looks, you can sense that this guy has, like, really, really been through shit. And the movie, like, slowly reveals that to us, exactly what all he's been through, and it all makes sense for his character. But when he's introduced, like, in pretty much in full, like, we get him a couple of times throughout before he's finally going to be a major character. And when he is finally a major character, you can get a sense of, like, a transition into something more dramatic. And, like, something that doesn't match with many of the things that are also in the movie. And that's especially where I got the vibe. I'm not quite sure what they wanted to go for exactly, whether it be like an over-the-top kids movie or somewhere in between. That sort of sweet spot that movies like this tend to aim for, which is the kids movie aspect, and the more, not necessarily for adults, but the more mature than, the a kids area of age, is and meeting in the middle somewhere. But it's like, it's kind of on the cusp of, it's a kids movie that sometimes goes back and forth between the super serious things. But the weird thing about that, though, is that when it gets serious, it does get really, really serious and kind of dark in places. So that kind of makes the tone seem even more completely and totally out of whack. So, I don't know, it's kind of confusing, but especially when they introduce another character very late, and that is Dan Stevens, who is the villain of the movie. And he walks in, and he's one of those characters where you can sense it. I mean, Harrison Ford's narrating throughout, and he says, like, he kind of builds up that he's going to have another owner that's maybe not so nice. And you don't quite, even with that narration, you're not quite prepared to see Dan Stevens the way he looks in this. He's got the evil mustache, he's got the sunglasses, and his suit looks like it was entirely made out of Ace Ventura's pants. So, and his performance matches this appearance as far as just how over the top he's gonna go. But at the same time, you can say that's Tony all over the place, but at the same time, it's like that is kind of what a lot of those, classic movies did, where they kind of had the sort of, like, they just kind of had their story, and then at some point they shoehorned in some over-the-top villain, and then that's going to give us a somewhat over-the-top climax to match that also. So basically it's over-the-top enough with everything being all cartoony with the dog, but the fact that Dan Stevens comes in, basically being his own cartoon in itself, brings a whole other thing into the movie. And like I said, so late in, too, which makes it feel even more out of place at the start. But the thing is the movie does spend enough time on all this stuff, whether it be the dog and how animated he looks, or the Dan Stevens character and how over-the-top evil he's supposed to be, that we kind of eventually just get used to those things. And they're more jarring at the start, the first time we see them, than by the time we're done with whatever story angle that is. So it is able to sort of at least pull it off enough. We just kind of have to get used to it before it's done, which some people may not be able to, which I would totally get. But I was pretty much able to, and I imagine most people probably will be also, unless they dislike the movie as a whole pretty early, in which that case, like, this is one of those days where if you're not with it in like the first 15 minutes or even the first 10 minutes, it's gonna be a struggle, especially since so much happens in the runtime that we have. It's like like I was saying, we get 3 or 4 different storylines here that could be their own movie. The movie is only an hour 45, and it's all crammed together. So it's probably going to seem like really long, but at the same time, I actually think it's, for the most, until it gets to the end, in which case it does kind of start to feel its length, but for how much they're packing into the runtime, I felt like the pacing was more or less fine. Like, it doesn't feel short, but it has a nice flow. Like, it didn't really reach that point, like I said, until maybe the last 10 minutes or so, where I was thinking, oh, they should probably move this on a little more. Like, I don't remember it ever being boring, which is kind of surprising, honestly. But it just has so much happening, just one right after the other, that it has no choice but to move. Like I said, so much happens in such a relatively short runtime for how much material there is. It might seem really long by the time you get to the end of it. There was the crowd in there with me was responding to it pretty well. There was, like, I go at the start of the day, because usually that's when not many people are there and there's no crowds or anything to fight through. This was like the most packed theater I've been in for a while. It was like there was like the front row, and that was about it. That was all that was open, was the front row, and this was like stadium seating. That's how many damn people were there. And this is one of those movies where when you can sense that it's ending when, like, the score kicks in and we get, like, landscape shots and there's narration and the dog's running around. People were walking out the door. They seemed really into the movie, but they seemed in a big damn hurry also by the time we reached the end of it. So I don't know if that was they felt like it felt long, or if they're just really impatient people. But yeah, I know some people just do that at the ends of movies, and I judge the shit out of you if you do. I'm sorry, but that's pretty much the way it is. So I think there are some things that don't make sense, like Karen Gillan's presence here. A very increasingly recognizable face that's basically here as a background character when Dan Stevens is introduced, and then seems to just disappear off the face of the earth shortly afterwards. I don't know. Bradley Whitford kind of does the same thing. Like, pretty much everybody that's not Harrison Ford or Dan Stevens or Omar Sy pretty much just has a glorified cameo. So, there's that. But I could imagine, if this did come out in, like, 1995 or 96, when I would have been 5 or 6, I probably would have been really, really into this. And that's not, that's not, like, a dig at it and saying, like, you can only enjoy something like this if you're, a child. But it's almost complimentary. That's, like, as far as it going back to that whole, classic Disney feel of movies like this, it reaches it enough that I got that feel, but not near as much as say something like Togo did. So yeah, so this was fine. Like I said, you just kind of have to decide early if you're gonna go along with it or not, because it does get it gets weirdly over the top for what it is in the way that it goes over the top. But yeah, it's fine, honestly. So there's that. And that Harrison Ford performance, that really does sort of ground it once it comes, even if it's still getting all slapsticky all around. And they're also trying to squeeze in a whole symbolic thing where the wild calling the dog is symbolized by this giant wolf that he keeps having visions of, and that seems to be trying to do something deeper than what it is we're actually looking at and everything surrounding it. But yeah, so kind of a tonal nightmare, but if you come to terms with that quickly, you'll probably be fine and just take it for what it is. And if not, you might have a struggle. So there's that. So let's go on to The Boy 2. Brahms as its official title, and then The Boy 2. Now, I don't necessarily go along with the whole idea of that whole comment where people say nobody asked for this movie, because it's like, you don't know what the fuck people are asking for. You don't know everybody off the face of the earth. With that said, this is a sequel to The Boy, a horror movie that came out in January of 2016. And I do have to ask how many people even remembered that movie existed. Because it was very much a January horror movie that just came and went, like every other January horror movie. And it was weird that, of all things, to suddenly emerge with a sequel 4 years later. They have 4 years to come up with a story and work on this thing. Because I do remember they left the first one hanging because the dude was still alive, because of course he was, because it was a horror movie. But it is a little baffling that this movie somehow exists and didn't go straight to DVD or straight to streaming. It's in theaters right now. I just saw it. So I don't know. It starts off in a weird place, because usually with horror movies you kind of have that opening that sort of sets the tone and it sets up the threat throughout the movie, and then it goes from there. But this one doesn't really have an opening. I almost felt like if I hadn't been there before it started, I would have thought I accidentally walked in on it. Because it's Katie Holmes coming in. Because so rarely, come to think of it, do horror movies begin, at least nowadays, with the actual main character. There's always that expendable character that's, killed for the sake of the opening, that sacrifices themselves to give the movie an opening. And this one just starts right away with Katie Holmes coming home, who's going to be the main character. And 1 minute in, it has got to be no more than 60 seconds into the movie that we get the first scares. And when movies are really desperate, once again, this is usually when we're talking straight to video territory, where the scares of the movie are the non-threatening characters scaring themselves, sometimes intentionally, sometimes not. But I guess her and her kid have this game where they jump out and they jump scare each other. So that's happening within 60 seconds. So this shows you how much ammo, horror-wise, this movie had going into it. How much they had up their sleeve. How much they were going to use to scare their audience, supposedly. That's what they have. Is a kid jumping out from the stairs and saying boo to his mom. That's our first scare, and it's 60 seconds or less in. But then we get our moment that supposedly sets the tone of the movie, which is this weird idea, and I guess it goes in with the tone of the first movie, where you know, for the uninitiated, I don't know why you'd be watching a review of this if you don't know how the first movie ends or what it even happened, but the interesting route that movie took, where the doll wasn't possessed or demonic or anything like that. It was being controlled by the actual Brahms that was living in the walls. And it was like, that movie is not great by any means, but that was like a really refreshing turn and made kind of a refreshing climax out of the movies we've gotten used to that are like this. I mean, so you know this movie was made strictly to shit on that. But before we get into that, I guess you could see it as sticking to the real life threat. The openings sequence of the movie that sets everything up is Katie Holmes being attacked in a home invasion. I mean, it's very poorly done, like very poorly edited, very poorly shot, and not particularly threatening. But it's something to open the movie. And it's, like I was saying, it's kind of refreshing to start off with by, you know, scaring the actual main character instead of just killing somebody we don't know immediately. There's something there that's a good idea, but like it's all about the execution, and this movie just completely botches that pretty quickly, and it doesn't really have much of a payoff, really. All it really does is set up the fact that it's going to scare the kid into not speaking and lead to... You know how when horror movies are on their downtime, they take their little, in quotes, character moments and try to build it up to make it look like they give a shit about something other than just, you know, screaming loud noises into our ears? And that's making the characters talk to each other and talk about their problems and their backstories or whatever. The whole dialogue, as far as building the characters, is the dad saying, do you want to talk about the home invasion, Katie Holmes? Should we talk about the home invasion? And she says no and walks away. And multiply that scene by about 20, and that's basically the dialogue that builds the character, I guess. The whole kid not talking thing doesn't really have a payoff either. He comes out of it like less than halfway through because he starts talking to the doll. Which, that's something, you know, that you could, I guess, call a payoff to the no-talking thing. But, I mean, it's not even there long enough to serve a purpose. Maybe just have him start talking to the doll, and that in itself is what the big deal to the parents is, not the fact that he's talking again, and it's like, oh, he's talking to a creepy doll, but we don't care he's talking again, so we're happy. So it's only biding their time until they start getting pissed off that he's talking to a doll. That's really all it's doing. They're biding their time until we get to the cliche moments we know are coming. They are biding their time in a movie that is 1 hour and 25 minutes with credits. So I don't know. There's a lot of red flags at the start here. And as far as the rest of the scares go, there's one whole sequence, probably in the halfway point or a little after, when Katie Holmes does go back to the old house, and it's basically like this house by itself, this supposedly abandoned house, is basically just a jump scare machine that was basically made to just scream at her. Like, just random things in the house are basically just screaming at her. But not necessarily screaming as much at her as they are just the audience in general. So that's pleasant. And then we get stuff like, there's a point in time where Katie Holmes decides she's going to check on the kid or something, or she's investigating whatever. One of the cliche horror shit reasons to be wandering around in a dark hallway. And some jump scare happens or something. And the dad comes running out of the room, trying to comfort her and saying, don't worry, it was just a dream, it was just a dream. She wasn't fucking sleeping. She was standing in the hallway. But he's saying, it was just a dream, whatever. But you may say this is a moot point, because this scene, where there's a jump scare and the dad says, don't worry, it was just a dream, even though she wasn't sleeping, is, in itself, a fucking dream. It's one of those movies. So, where every time, like half the time there's a scare, it's immediately followed up with Katie Holmes sitting up in bed gasping. So, get used to that shit. And as far as the creepiness factor, because you tend to you get so caught up in the jump scares, and so many movies get caught up in doing them, that you pretty much appreciate anything in a horror movie that's not that's trying to genuinely be creepy. And the only things of that sort that this movie has is she'll be looking at the doll 1 minute and he's looking ahead, and then she'll look back and his head will have turned. And that's all they have. So they keep using that. Every time the doll is in a scene, that's the payoff. Is he may or may not be turning his head when she looks away. And that's it. There you go. And then they start getting into this whole thing, much like the first movie. Despite the fact that they already went through this. But here we go again. I think they're trying to give us the idea, or put the idea in our heads, what if she's actually going insane? And it's like, if I remember correctly, this is exactly what we went through with the first movie. And it's going to be the same answer. So, because they do the thing where, like, a table gets turned over or something while her kid is in the room. And it's like just him and Brahms. And then the dad comes in and sees the table turned over, and she's like, this is supernatural shit or something. And he's like, or she's saying he did it, she's saying the kid did it. And he's like, this table's too heavy, the kid wouldn't have done that. And then he, like, narrows his eyes at her. And it's and it's like, is she crazy or is she not? Well, we know that's not going to be the case. We know they don't have the balls to go that route. They exercise the extent of their balls with the ending of the first movie, of there being an actual physical Brahms living in the walls and not some paranormal bullshit. But then, as you would suspect, paranormal bullshit will find its way here, and once again, they get into it really late. There's like 20 minutes left, and they introduce like 5 new characters. It's like visiting family members or something. And then I guess the doll can just make bad shit happen with its presence? I think is what they're trying to show us there. I don't know. I mean, is it because we introduced mainly this piece of shit bully kid. That's the only reason this family comes over, so we can get this bully kid, so that he can terrorize the kid and then get some sort of gruesome comeuppance. And he is just a kid, but I don't know, am I a terrible person for maybe thinking that what happens to this kid might be the most satisfying thing in the entire movie? I don't know. It can't save the movie by any means, nothing could, but it's a little something, I guess. So then, once we pass that, we're basically at the end. Like, I think we're at the end before the movie even realizes we're at the end. And then it just starts to speed things up real quick, throw in all the cliches, throw in all the bullshit ending scene, the climax that we've seen in so many damn paranormal horror movies at this point. And it takes pretty much the exact route you would expect. Abandoning everything in the first movie to go on its completely own path, involving years going back to the 1800s and paranormal bullshit. But there is something totally baffling about this. Is you could say, oh my god, they totally butchered the sacred territory of the first movie, and its little story turns. I don't know. Because it's the same writer, and it's the same director. Which is something I would not have guessed. I had to look it up. So, I don't think there's any explaining that away. I have no idea how this happened or why they would do that. They got, like, I mean, the movie didn't receive critical acclaim, the first one, but I remember a lot of people being really happy with the direction that the climax went and what the reveal was. And so you wait 4 years just to say, well, fuck that shit. We want to be like everybody else. Why? It's almost like they got upset that they were praised for doing something a little different. And in a particular era, they wouldn't have been doing anything different. But since it was made in this era, it was something different. But they don't want that, apparently. They want to do the cliche shit. They want to actively be as uncreative as possible. I don't understand how this happens, but alright. Now we've got possessions and shit, and we've got the dog causing accidents with its mind, or whatever you want to call it. That's what it is now. So, yeah. I don't know what else you can possibly say about that. Or why a writer and a director would want to just completely and totally go through a full movie's worth of self-sabotage 4 years after the fact. But here we are. The only possible explanation is that these are insane people. But insane people would have come up with something so much more creative than this. Insane people, right, I don't even know what the fuck, I don't even have an example offhand. The stuff that's unexplainably insane. And instead you get this shit, which is every single cliche horror movie 101 now. So, yeah. Whatever the fucking point of that was, there it is. So, go ahead and feel free to ask if anybody asked for this, because I don't think that's possible. But, there we go. Okay. Let's go on to the third movie. I think I want to talk about the Disney Plus movie next, which is Timmy Failure, Mistakes Were Made. Mistakes Were Made is the subtitle. And this is a movie I saw like a YouTube ad for or something, and I just didn't really think it was anything. It just looked like, it honestly looked like a movie that was straight to streaming, that was just, it was a kid that had an imaginary polar bear or something, and that's all I saw. And it was like, well, I won't worry about that. And then, a few days ago, I learned something that nearly makes my head explode, which is who directed Timmy Failure, Mistakes Were Made. Timmy Failure, Mistakes Were Made was directed by Tom McCarthy, and I don't know how many people realize that. Tom McCarthy, as in the director of Spotlight and The Station Agent, made this movie. The Visitor made this movie. So that immediately got my attention and interest. And now it was more of a curiosity thing than anything else. And so, and because I was initially getting like maybe, you know, very vague like Diary of a Wimpy Kid vibes. And apparently this one's also a book series, but I've never heard of this prior to this, so I don't know. And McCarthy has this way of really showing off his range, where he can make movies that are like definitely him and maybe not so much him, and maybe be weird when you think about it. Like the fact that he pretty much made Spotlight and The Cobbler with Adam Sandler nearly simultaneously. He has another movie coming out this year that he probably made very close to this called Stillwater, which is an extremely serious sounding movie with Matt Damon. So, yeah. But in the meantime, we have Timmy Failure, Mistakes Were Made. I can't get over that full title. So, yes, it is a movie that starts off with some big, giant mishap happening, and then Timmy Failure narrating and telling us, this is the ending, we better start at the beginning. Just a week after Sonic, we have that all over again. And like I said, I'm late on this, so it was probably around the same time as Sonic. Two movies around the exact same time, with that same opening, with that same cliche. But, alright, at least with this, it kind of feels like it fits the tone a little bit. So, there's that, especially since the kid fancies himself like a detective, so so we're getting that vibe from him. And I was wondering, the first thing I wondered going in was if Timmy Failure was actually supposed to be his real name, and the very first thing we're introduced to is that it used to be spelled in a very fancy way, but now it's actually spelled like failure. And when I mentioned that to my brother, he said, I hope we see it on a mailbox. And I swear to God, one of the first shots of their name is on the mailbox, of course. So, Timmy Failure, if you are unaware, is a 5th grader that is completely and totally out of touch with his own reality, and decides that he is going to be a detective with his own detective agency called Total Failure, I believe. And his partner in this, he's had a couple of partners, but he's had to fire them. So his only partner left is his imaginary friend, and his imaginary friend is a 1,500-pound total or polar bear named Total. So yeah, and there's pretty much one joke here throughout this entire movie, and that is that the kid has a very, like, deadpan delivery, and he speaks and acts like a detective, and he uses, like, all the terminology. Pretty much everything he says is intended to be some sort of catchphrase. Like, he has, like, 3 or 4 lines in this movie that are just repeated from beginning to end. And that's basically what this is. And there's one interesting sort of, I guess you could call it a running thing, where it seems to, pretty much everywhere he goes, the polar bear is here, either wreaking havoc off to the side, or just hanging out in the background, like scratching himself against walls. And after a while, throughout the movie, it becomes more and more, it's sort of like the whole Stewie talking thing on Family Guy, where you're not quite sure who hears him and who doesn't. The movie gets more and more ambiguous as it goes on as to if people can see this polar bear besides him or not, which is an interesting direction to go with that. But the interesting thing about this, really, despite its one joke idea, is the style of it. And even though it does look like, it definitely looks like a movie based off like a series of children's books or young adult books or somewhere in between there. If you're familiar with his movies, like the ones I mentioned, it still somehow also definitely feels like a Tom McCarthy movie. Where he's somehow managed to mix together what you would expect to find on Disney streaming service and a Tom McCarthy movie. Somehow end up in the same movie. And the fact that he's kind of able to pull that off to where it's not like something he seemed to have just kind of phoned in. Like, his signature style feels like it's here. So there is that, but sometimes it may not always mesh with the events that happen. But it is, funny for the most part. Like I said, even most of it's one joke. There is some funny stuff here and there. Like, there's almost a continuous thing going on where there's the running joke where there's an event that's about to happen or something that's described to him, and we see it first as he envisions it as an over-imaginative child versus what it actually looks like in real life. The funniest one probably being what he imagines a fencing class is. So you get jokes like that work fine, regardless of how much they're there. And it's another thing about it actually having like McCarthy's sort of like tone and style is the fact that it's able to jump around a lot. Like, this will keep the attention of, like, really small children because it jumps around so much. But it's not really obnoxious in the way that it does that like you probably expect it to do in a movie like this, with a style like that. Because it's, like, kind of like I was just talking about with Call of the Wild. There's, like, so much going on in such a small period of time, where this movie is only, like, an hour 30-something or an hour 40. And they're bouncing around in a lot of different things going on. But I guess you could say that's sort of going after the whole detective thing. Like, a lot of those old detective movies and stories had a shitload going on, like, all at once, all the time, that all somehow connected in some more or less convoluted way. Even the better ones. Even the better classic detective stories have their convoluted side. And there are individual scenes that stand out when they're doing this jumping around. There's a scene that stands out in a good way, like when they attempt to go into a bank wearing fencing masks, and everything goes awry and not as they planned. And then there's this scene at a dam, which when the scene started, I thought was going to be a lot better than it was, and maybe have a bigger payoff than it does. You can almost see, almost like budget restraints in this damn scene quite a bit, which is weird. I talked about this with some of the shit like Noelle that they put out, where you can see the budget restraints despite the fact that this is Disney streaming service. You'd think they'd be going all in, but you can see budgetary things that make it look and feel kind of cheap, even despite having the sort of McCarthy indie feel at its heart. Those things are still noticeable, especially when they go for the big effects that don't exactly completely and totally pay off. And you've got some recognizable faces here that show up and play the parts that you'd probably expect them to play. Like Wallace Shawn is the teacher that he's constantly butting heads with. Craig Robinson is here, kind of almost seems to be doing a version of his character in Morse from America, if anybody saw that. Where it's like, you expect one thing out of Craig Robinson, but he's also able to do like the sort of sensitive mentor thing as well, pretty convincingly. There's some really good scenes here with his mom, where she's kind of the one that she's willing to, embrace and encourage him in the things he wants to do. But then when it gets out of hand, she's like his potential door to reality, and she's the one that has to ground him in more ways than one, whether it be reality or in a punishment sense. And those scenes are nice. And then there's the character of his mom's new boyfriend, which could have been a pretty cliche character, and I mean, it's not like he's a fresh character by any means, but he's like the likable, like, he has that likable dorkiness enough that he works in his scenes as well. So yeah, there is the stuff like that, but honestly, when it comes to this, and I'm sure people will see this differently, and maybe this was just me, or maybe I was just in a weird mood when I watched this, I don't know, but I'm all for movies about imaginative kids, because it can definitely take you back to those moments, like how, like, especially, like, me in my own childhood with, like, the kid or kids that lived next door. There was a lot of, stuff like this going on, but at the end of the day, we just, at the end of the day was real life, regardless of what age we were. And the fact that this kid has pretty much created his entirely own reality kind of gets a little weird. To where it's like, on one side it's like, it's great to see the movie and the characters around it, like, trying to embrace, the use of imagination. And there's, obviously a message in here that's not as strong as it probably could be. They probably could have delved a little more into it. And explored it a little more, trying to differentiate with Timmy between what's his reality and what's actual reality. And it's like any minute now, and maybe this is like a setback to it, almost having an indie feel to it, is that I'm pretty sure this even played at Sundance. So it's there, but as it goes on, and the more he refuses to come out of this reality that he's the world's, or at least not the world's best detective, but this town, this city's best detective, and this agency is a real thing. His little hand-drawn credentials are very sacred to him and very official. And it's like, you almost expect with the indie feel, any second this is going to suddenly take a hard turn into like a mental health drama. Like, any second. But it never reaches that. It always stays the upbeat, children's adventure movie. And it started to feel a little weird the more he got, like, obsessed with his own make-believe reality. And like I said, and the way they acknowledge that, I think we're supposed to acknowledge that to an extent, but they don't want us to acknowledge it too much. But it's kind of hard not to. It gets a little weird. But like I said, maybe that's just me. Maybe I was in a weird mood when I saw it. I don't know. But that kind of held it back to what I think it, like, could have been. To where if it was sort of the embracing imagination thing, but it's the character that can be a bit off. But he can be very funny, but he can also be pretty off-putting too. So there's kind of an uneven balance in that. So that's kind of what brings the movie down, but it's not terrible or anything. And I think its target demographic, I think, will like it just fine, even if it's something they may not, remember next week or something. So yeah, so let's end on the Netflix release of this week, which is The Last Thing He Wanted. Dee Reese's new movie, who directed Mudbound, and it stars Anne Hathaway, Ben Affleck, and Willem Dafoe, and Rosie Perez. Well, to start off, and I don't want to seem nitpicky, that's not exactly the snappiest title, is it? Like, that doesn't exactly just roll off the tongue as a title. But, we'll try to get past that, and we'll see what the story is. So, while watching it, I tried to figure out what the story was. And about 2 hours later, I was still searching. I think one thing that probably holds this back a lot is I don't know if I would completely say with ease that Hathaway is miscast, but she is uncharacteristically unconvincing in this part. Like, I don't know if it's the script or if it's her performance or what, but she is despite that cast, she is very much the center of it, and she's the one that's everything is playing off of, and she's playing off everything, so her performance and this character are very central to how much the rest of the movie works. And based on how much of the movie works, it seems like there's something rotten in the state of Denmark here, and Hathaway is at the center of it, so it just kind of adds up to that. And it's basically her. She gets caught up in one story, and then she meets up with Willem Dafoe again, who is her dad, who has a sort of dementia of sorts. And to the point that I was kind of starting to wonder every time he would say, like, I have not, like, in a way he would say he has no idea what's going on, he has no idea where everybody is, or where this character is, or what all of this is. And it was like, I imagine this must have been the most relatable character to the writers, so, judging by the product. So it's bouncing around everywhere, and this is one of those movies where, like, every 5 or 10 minutes or so, Anne Hathaway jumps to a new location, and we're talking, like, different countries, like, all over the world. And so, like, every 10 minutes, they give you something that resembles the start of a story or the jumping off point to something that's going to be more exciting. And then she goes to another country, and then, like, her location is typed up on the screen to tell us where she is. And that's, like, every scene transition. Is her bouncing to a new place, and the location name being typed up on the screen, and so on, and all of that. I haven't even had a bad feeling at the start, and I don't like to turn on movies as soon as they start, because there's just an unfairness to that. But it's like, the start of it is just like what appears to be real footage of, like, these war-torn countries and all that, and it coming up on the screen is the stuff that she's typing, but it's in, like, the lingo of her profession, so it makes no fucking sense to us. And that's what they use to try to lure us in, because it's the opening scene. We get it in place of opening credits. It's the first thing we see, and we don't know what the fuck we're looking at. And that's the start of it. And that alienation pretty much stays throughout the entire rest of the movie. So I still could barely figure out what was he like. And just when you get a sense of, alright, I think I see where this is, like, I see what direction we're headed now and what the character's purpose is. And it's like, it's not like it's hiding it from you and you have to figure it out like it's a puzzle. No, it's just, it's so jumbled, you don't know what the hell you're looking at and when and what its purpose is or why this character's doing that. And once you've seen the full outcome is when you get the sense of, oh, this wasn't a puzzle at all. It's just... it's just completely jumbled. So they throw stuff in, like Ben Affleck's character, who's barely here, and it's like it's a nothing part. It makes you wonder why the hell they pursued him for it. But it's like, well, he just did Triple Frontier, so it's like Triple Frontier is basically Disney, or Netflix is basically Disney, to where it's like you do one movie with them, you're stuck with them basically. That's the only way I can think of. He was stuck in this movie somehow. So there is a moment where he and Hathaway end up in bed together for a reason I was never able to figure out. There's nothing that really hints at that before, and there's nothing that really hints at that after. It's just like, oh, we're making a movie, and what do movies have? They have a scene where if there is a male and female character, we must have a scene where they're naked in bed together, trading irrelevant dialogue, because that scene's in movies all the time. It's hardly ever works in any other movie. It surely won't work in ours, but we'll put it in there anyway because, hey, we're making a movie. Something that resembles a movie, I guess. There's no other reason I can think of for that. There are so many questions that you throw at this movie, and none of them involve the intrigue of story. You're just constantly asking questions, none of which have to do with you being invested in this in any way whatsoever. And that's the thing too, is when you're following her character, she bounces around so much and there's so many different things it's trying to do that you're not sure if they even connect or not, or if the writers even know if they connect or not. We're never quite sure how or why she gets invested in the things she gets invested in. It's just things are we're just watching things happen. Kind of. That's when it's at its most decent, is when it looks like one unconnected thing happens and then another unconnected thing happens. And it's like, well, at least things are happening. That's better than the alternative, isn't it? I don't even know in this case. And there are so many times where they use the same technique to try to get us to think something riveting is happening. And that is the same shot of the camera zooming in on Hathaway as her eyes widen, where she's figured something out. And then she runs off to do something else that feels entirely unrelated to the things in the game before it. And that's what the whole movie is, until it reaches a really idiotic conclusion. And very anticlimactic, but I wouldn't have expected anything more from this movie by that point. There is... And it's also kind of hard to get involved with her because it seems like... There's not... You talk about getting invested in a character and, like, feeling for the character and, you know... Like, every moment that character goes to is something that you're yourself invested in, but it's like, there is not one, but there is at least 2 instances, if not 3, in this movie where Anne Hathaway is in the middle of some sort of ambush where bullets are flying everywhere, and she's practically in the middle of this, and she's caught up in it. And it seems like there's real danger, there's real suspense that's about to potentially happen here. And she gets out of this situation the same way every time. She just runs away. She's in the middle of, like, an ambush, and she just runs away with no threat. Nobody follows her. No bullets even come close to her somehow. And that's just what she does. Danger happens, and she can just run away, and that's it. She even so much as runs away, gets on a plane, and takes off while one of these is happening. And it is perfectly fine, perfectly safe. Nothing's going to happen. Nothing's ever going to happen. So that's the kind of riveting suspense you're going to get. And then at some point, you know, Toby Jones shows up with like 15 minutes to go. Like I said, that's always the best time. Once again, we just fucking talked about this with The Boy. It's like, that's a great time to introduce characters with like 15 minutes left. Good job. And while, you know, Toby Jones's presence is always welcome, you're totally and completely checked out by that point. He could be saying fucking anything. And everything he's saying doesn't fucking matter. He's describing his house. With about 15 minutes left of what feels like a very long movie. The pacing is fucking terrible. It's an hour 55. If I had to guess when it was over, if I didn't know, I would say we were pushing 2.5 hours at least. And with about 15 minutes to go, we are introduced to a character that just describes his house to us. And his taste in music. So there it is. So you think, well, Dia Reese is this director they keep building up. Like she's like a really big deal. Like I said, I didn't think much of Mudbound, but maybe she got something. She did Pariah. But it's like, as far as a visual flair to this movie, as far as anything trying remotely to bring this movie to life, there's one shot towards the beginning where her daughter's away at school, and you got Hathaway on the phone at home talking to her, and then the camera seems to come through the wall, and on the other side of the wall is the school, and the daughter's talking to her on the phone. And it's like, well, that's kind of a cool shot. Well, there's no shots like that again. There's no, like, anything in regards to visual creativity. That's the best we get. That's the, not just the best we get, that's the only thing we get. So, there you go. So I don't know what the purpose of this movie is, but it exists for some reason. And straight to Netflix is about right. We were just getting all happy about Netflix saying, hey, you're doing a little better. You're not as bad as you used to be as far as your original stuff goes. And then this happens, and yeah. So wasn't there another one recently? Farmageddon was them. So I guess there's that. But I am looking forward to Spencer Confidential in a couple of weeks. So we'll see if they can bring themselves back. And we'll see if Peter Berg and Mark Wahlberg can bounce back after Mile 22. I really hope that happens. So, but before that, we have The Invisible Man with Elizabeth Moss and some other things next week. So, and then the week after that, on top of Spencer Confidential, is Onward, and we're getting Ben Affleck again, only in a much more substantial role, so maybe he'll get to show off a lot more, in a role that sounds like it's going to be much more personal than this throwaway shit that he was in for some reason. So, yeah, I think that's going to be it for this week, and there's the next week's, and Versus, and all that will be here as well. So until all that stuff, I think that's it.